stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting. If relationships are the key to happiness, communication is the doorway, and communication is most effective when we use stories as the foundation. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, and to connect, but what we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you, and you'll nod your head in understanding. And then we'll dig into the lessons from each of those situations. When I'm working with my communication clients, I remind them to listen for understanding, not necessarily to respond. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen to consider your related stories, to listen and consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. Today I have the opportunity to speak with Nicole from Reborn, an organization trying to leverage social media to decrease our rates of suicide. So I invited my friend Nicole to come and talk on the podcast and tell us a couple of stories. She has a nonprofit called Reborn, and it's a really fascinating idea of finding ways to leverage social media to improve lives in terms of reconnecting and changing the path of our suicide rate, which has been going up and up. And that is something that's really dear to me. And it's one of the reasons I started the No Longer Virtual conferences, was because I see that people are forgetting how to connect face to face, how to talk to each other, and we have to model it. So I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about what you're doing with your nonprofit, but mostly I want to hear the story behind it. So let's start just by, I'm going to ask you kind of a silly question that I ask most of my guests. What can you tell me about yourself that other people generally don't know? Something that might surprise somebody that's listening to this podcast that knows you via LinkedIn or social media.
Now that's a good question. I have given this a little bit of thought because I'm such an open person that I like to think everybody knows everything about me. But something that some people are really surprised to learn is that I'm very creative. I'm very right-brained. I taught myself how to play guitar, acoustic guitar, piano. I love photography. I recently got into film photography. I carry around my Instax camera everywhere I go, taking Polaroids. So I'm absolutely in love with the arts. That's something I spend a lot of my time with.
And why do you think people would be surprised by that?
I think it's because I have such an outwardly analytical personality that some people think perhaps I'm more left-brained in how I do my day-to-day life. But surprisingly enough, I am very, very into the creative aspects and the arts that exist.
So you're super organized, right?
Oh, of course, absolutely.
Okay, that's the left brain side of you. Well, that is really interesting, and I'm not actually that surprised by it. Partly because a lot of the people I know that are in the technical fields, that are software engineers, are also musicians and artists. A lot of them. So it doesn't really surprise me much. But tell me a story about something creative that you did recently that was something special.
Recently, I'm in college right now. I'm in my senior year. I'll be graduating with my bachelor's in counseling and psychology in 60 days now, which is pretty exciting.
Wow.
And I am in an innovation and creativity class, which is a wonderful class opportunity on my campus. And we recently designed vision boards. And that was probably one of the most recent times where I saw my creative side flourish. My professor brought in paints and canvas and magazines for us to cut out pictures from. And I just put together this beautiful artistic piece of work with just using my hands. He didn't even bring in any paintbrushes. And I just was using one finger the entire time. And I painted these beautifully intricate flowers like I've never painted anything before. I was feeling so inspired, and that's probably the biggest and most recent time that I really honed in on that creative side of myself. It was a really great experience.
Wow, I love that. And did your professor say something about what you had created?
My professor and everybody that I showed, they were surprised. They were not necessarily at how it turned out, but the process, how the process was. I telling them, I didn't go into it knowing what I was going to paint. I didn't have any idea laid out. I just kind of picked some colors and it came to be. And I only used my hands, the tools that I was given. And they were all surprised to hear that, how capable I was of doing something like that, and how capable it is for anybody to do something like that. I feel like we assume, oh, you need paintbrushes to paint a flower. You need
Mhm.
to have all these specific tools in order to achieve something. But we were given these tools right here, our hands, and you can do incredible things with them.
Oh, I love that story. I love that. Did anyone in your past tell you that you weren't creative?
I'd like to think not necessarily that I wasn't creative, but I come from a family who is very creative. So with that comes these unspoken standards that you feel like you have to live up to, where you have family
Oh,
members who are singers and you have family members who are artists. So even if nobody necessarily says that you're not creative, you constantly feel like you have to meet a specific standard in order to be considered so.
isn't that funny? And
Yeah.
I think especially, do you have siblings?
I have a younger sister right in the room next door.
Okay, yes. And I have to add this because you just kind of triggered some memories for me. My sister has an outstanding voice. She sings big, and
Mm.
she's not much bigger than I am. We're about the same size. And she has this big Broadway voice. And she has always been the one who would jump up and sing. And I was very shy, which that would surprise people that I was
Mhm.
very shy. And I still, every once in a while, get a little nervous and uncomfortable when I'm in an environment, certain environments. But I was very shy. So if somebody asked me to sing, I would say, no, no, no. But if you ask my sister, she'd jump up and say, absolutely. And she'd just start singing with or without accompaniment. And so my parents, my family all described my sister as the singer, even
Mm.
though I was in honor choir in middle school and choir. And I actually did chamber music my sophomore, junior, and
Mm.
senior years of high school, where, it's intense ear, where you're singing your own part among eight other. I was one of eight voices, each singing our own part. So
Wow.
you have to really develop an ear. But I never considered myself a singer because Karen was the singer.
Mm.
So I'm really relating to what you just said. That's really funny. Well, let's get into the meat of the podcast because I know that you have some really important stories to share, and we may make some people cry, but we'll also make them laugh. So
Yes.
let's start with the story that really drove you to start Reborn. And there must be something really specific that happened that I'm guessing was tragic, because that's how a lot of these really important movements begin.
So I'd actually like to share two stories.
Yes.
The story of my co-founder, Maggie Rose, who is obviously not present at this time. She's actually in another meeting, but she is kind of the spark of the idea, and I came along later, so I'll share her story. She tells it incredibly. She went cliff jumping one day with one of her friends, and she wasn't going to jump by any means. She went up just to watch him. She describes it as a 10-story high jump off of this huge cliff. And she was standing at the edge, just looking, at the beautiful creation around her. And her friend pushed her off of the cliff. And she was not expecting it. She said as she was falling, she only had time for two thoughts. The first one was, this is so high, I'm going to die. And the second one was, if I were jumping to kill myself, it would be a mistake. She hit the water, and she immediately, after that experience, started doing research. Why did I have that thought? I'm not feeling particularly depressed, but why would I think that? So she started doing research, and she found that 100% of people who survived jumping regretted it the minute that they jumped. So then this sparked her interest. What am I going to do? How do we simulate that experience? What what exactly goes through somebody's mind the moment that they jump that allows them to have this realization. You know, adrenaline is coursing through their veins. It must push them out of these layers of depression to help them to see clearly. You hear stories of women who are able to lift up cars with the adrenaline to save their children. You know, you hear these incredible stories of what adrenaline can do. So how do we mimic that? And that's where she came up with the idea of Reborn. And I remember the first time I met her, this is where my story comes in. We went and got Chinese food and sat in her house at night. It was the first time we were hanging out, and we just started sharing our life stories with each other. And of course, that's how all great friendships start. And we were just laying it all on the table. And I shared with her an experience that I had with the mental health field, and that was with my sister. My sister and I come from very similar upbringings. I'm sure she's hearing me talking about her right now in the other room, but I told her to keep quiet. We came from very similar upbringings. Obviously, we're in the same household. We come from lives of abuse and lives with a mother who struggles with paranoid schizophrenia. We have backgrounds very oriented around the circumstances that make it very easy to fall into a depressed state, I guess you could say. And people are very surprised to see me doing school so well and throwing myself into education because it wasn't the same for her. And she went through a time where she was really depressed, and it got to the point where the police ended up picking her up and having to take her to the hospital because somebody had phoned in saying that she had cut herself. We had sat in the emergency room thinking this is absolutely impossible, only to find out months later, as she's wearing shorts in the middle of summer, that it was true. But the staff never discovered it. They weren't thorough enough with their search. They weren't thorough enough with their questions. They never realized that what was ensuing actually had happened. And they were very neglectful of providing her with the proper treatment. And that sparked my need to change something. So those are kind of our stories. We came together. We started sitting down every day, as much as we could, and really, thinking, how do we change the world now? We are driven women, and we have this fearless leadership. So we are planning to utilize what we have at our fingertips, to change the world. And that's kind of where Reborn comes in. And that's really what our goal is to, change the face of traditional mental health and the face of suicide at its core, really bringing about a new sense of urgency.
Wow. I can't imagine somebody pushing me off a cliff. I mean, that's my first thought is, So I just have to ask one clarification question.
Sure.
I'm assuming you mean of the people who survive a jump.
Yes.
100% of them regret it the moment that they leave. So that comes back to when somebody takes a gun to their face or mouth or whatever, that the assumption is the same, that as soon as the trigger's pulled, that they have that instant. Of course, jumping gives you more time, and pills probably give people more time, but wow, that's intense. So one of the things we talked a little bit about was that I started No Longer Virtual because of the disconnect, and we need to talk face-to-face more and make sure people understand that we as humans are designed for in-person relationships. We're designed that way. I always think about that awful experiment with the monkeys. Was it Maslow and his monkeys? No, I'm thinking of the wrong scientist. But anyway, he had these two different monkeys, and he put a fake mother of wire that could provide milk, and the fake mother that had fur on her. And the baby monkeys preferred to be on the furry mother, even though they were hungry. And there are so many other experiments that are a little less depressing and awful in terms of abusing baby monkeys. But what always strikes me is how much more we get from a face-to-face conversation, but then forget how important it is not even 10 minutes later. So I'll go into a room, for instance, I'm part of an organization called the Women's Leadership Network. And before I go in, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Facebook, I'm building my business, and I'm like, ugh, I got to go to this meeting. It's not, I have so much to do. It's almost all digital. I mean, clearly laundry, kids, all the other stuff, but what's in my mind is all the stuff I have to do digitally. And then I walk into that room and these women, they hug me, and I'm immediately refilled. And I know that our senses pick up things subconsciously that we don't pick up consciously, like certain scents and certain micro expressions on our faces, and even a touch that we may not necessarily recognize or feel. Our bodies feel it, and our brains respond to it in such a positive and enthusiastic way. And what I'm curious about is a story that you can share that you were able to leverage your social media in order to fix something that was offline, or at least resolve some issue. Do you have a specific story about that?
So a story where social media has helped me to resolve an in real life conflict.
Yes. How did you leverage that? Your
How did I
relationships
leverage?
online?
That's a very good question. Because I almost feel like it's easier to come up with examples for the opposite, how you utilize your in-person interactions to leverage your social media interactions.
Yeah, but that's kind of easy, right?
That's so much easier.
It is. And that's the struggle.
It is. And trying to think of a specific story where I've been able to leverage social media. I mean, just thinking about the ease of access to reach people. I think of so many friends of mine who I know in person who struggle, and being somebody in the field of counseling and psychology, you automatically become the counselor of the friend group. So you automatically are entitled to fix their problems. So whenever a conflict arises, I know, learning how to do self-care as well is an important component, but that's for a whole other conversation. But utilizing social media in terms of the ease of access, that's always been the most benefit. When I'm not able to physically be there, I can virtually be there for people who are struggling, my friends that are depressed, suicidal. If I'm not able to make the hour drive, if I'm not able to make the 30-minute drive, I have my phone. I have the ability to call them, text them, message them on Facebook, have a conversation. It's interesting how much more comfortable people are behind a screen to share how they're feeling, especially men, as opposed to in person. Utilizing Facebook Messenger is one of the main means that I talk to a lot of my guy friends, because talking about feelings in person is so uncomfortable. It's so almost out of their nature to do that, because men are not as emotionally not emotionally nurtured, but as in tune with their emotions, perhaps, or as comfortable with being in tune with their emotions as women are. So social media and texting is probably the main means in which I interact with them. And it's definitely interesting to see, how that really is something that exists in society today.
So have you had an incident specifically where you were able to talk somebody down from the ledge and then go see them face to face so that you could continue the conversation?
I haven't necessarily been in a specific position with somebody that is at that moment in time suicidal, and I need to go be the one to help them. But I have had cases where I have been speaking with people who are depressed, talking about not necessarily hurting themselves, but more removing themselves from the things that they're involved in, moving, running away, not necessarily death per se, but I have been in situations where, I think of, I don't know if I want to disclose their names, but I think of
you don't have to. Definitely not.
I think of a few people, that's for sure.
That's interesting. So one of the things that I've been really struggling with is how to leverage that, and specifically that kind of story. And I'll give you an example. Um, a few years ago, when I first started on this path of understanding that disconnect
Mm,
and seeing it so clearly, there were a couple of young girl suicides here in my little town, and our town is only 30,000 people, so everyone knows everyone or is connected in some way or another. Hearing my son, who was friends with this young woman, talk about her, he said, I just had no idea. And
mhm,
yet, if you looked online, you could see kind of this trajectory through social media, through Facebook and Snapchat, that she was clearly going through some weird stuff, but it wasn't necessarily obvious that she was depressed. But one of the things that I realized was that she didn't know how to reach out face to face. So she was reaching out in some ways online, and people, I think, were picking it up online. But because she couldn't translate that
mhm,
to a face-to-face relationship, she wasn't getting what she needed to change the dynamic. And
mm,
here's my specific example. I was going through this about 3 years ago, really coming to grips with what my hypothesis was, and trying to figure out how to either confirm or find out I was full of crap. Um, I was writing something on LinkedIn and about meeting face to face and how important it was. And a woman that I had been connected with for a couple of years was responding, and we had kind of this back and forth conversation through comments, about 5 or 6 back and forth. And she was kind of telling me that I was wrong,
mm,
that because she's an introvert, this was the only way that she could get to the social activity that she needed or wanted, because she really was so shy. It was so painful for her to be in public and in groups of other people, that this was her way of addressing that. And she could still write and she could still interact with people, but she didn't have to see them face to face. And she
mm,
was trying to explain to me why that was okay. And at some point, I just kind of knew something behind there was bigger than she was sharing. And it wasn't, LinkedIn isn't the place to share that kind of issue. So I sent her a message and said, let's take this offline. Why don't you give me a call? So she called me, and she was adamant about how important it was to use social media for her, whether it's LinkedIn, Facebook, or whatever. And I was trying to explain that I agreed that there was a time and a place for it. But my concern was that without face to face conversation, you're missing a big part of your humanity.
mhm,
And she was adamant. It was probably 12 or 14, 15 minutes of conversation when finally I heard her. It was almost like that gasp, that,
mm,
and she started bawling, just sobbing, weeping over the phone. And I didn't know what to do. I'm not a counselor. I don't have any of that training. I don't have the capacity to deal with what she was going through. And I didn't know I was pushing her buttons to this point. But it was over the phone. Again, if I was face to face, I would completely have known that. But the next words out of her mouth, and we were both bawling, she said, I'm just so lonely.
mm,
And that hypothesis was crystal clear at that point, that I was right, at least for some people, that they were trying to replace human relationships, interactions, with exclusively online or very, very limited offline conversations and relationships. And that's why I'm so fascinated with the work that you're doing
mm.
of leveraging social media to resolve that issue, that disconnect, that conflict.
Yes, and that's a situation that occurs so frequently, is these people grow up or become so comfortable, labeling themselves as introverts, that they almost develop social anxiety on their own,
Mm-hmm.
unintentionally, because they what we have to really do is, when we utilize social media, it can't be mindlessly. If we want to be effective and impactful, there has to be an intentional influence in the way in which you utilize social media, a very intentional means of going about your interactions and your contact. Because that's kind of, I almost feel like, where people do start to develop this social anxiety and this need that is generated to not go out in public, because they spend so many hours mindlessly using their phones, and they think everything is on this phone, and Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, everything is there. But are you using it intentionally, or are you using it mindlessly? When you're using it mindlessly, you feel alone. You feel that nobody's really around you, because what is the quality of the relationships that you're having versus the quantity of the relationships that you're having? That's a big question. Is you could have 8,000 followers, 1 million followers, 10 million followers, but how many of those are really quality relationships? How many of those people do you get on the phone with and bawl your eyes out telling them that you're lonely?
Not many.
Not many, and so many people have their guard up too. That's another issue when they utilize social media or in their in-life interactions, is they put their guard up, that they utilize the computer as a boundary. If I can say anything on here, I'm protected. They can't see me. They can't see how I'm reacting. And then when they go in person interactions, they don't have that barrier anymore. So they shut themselves out. They isolate themselves.
So do you think part of that is the fear that that they won't match up to what they're putting out there, and they're concerned that whoever meets them in person might be disappointed?
I think that is absolutely accurate for some people, is that they're worried that perhaps, because it's so easy to make yourself appear better on social media, you get to pick and choose what you post. You're in control of that. But when you're in real life, you're walking down the street, you have neighbors, you have friends and family, they know everything that's going on, and that's scary to people. That causes anxiety in people because they can't really control that. So absolutely, I feel like that's one component of many as to why people get nervous when it comes to in-person interactions.
So do you have an example of something that you've done in terms of being intentional in your social media activity? A specific instance that you could describe?
Absolutely. I am a very outward Christian. I became a Christian when I was in 8th grade. And something that I'm super intentional about is I like to post on my Facebook and ask if anybody needs prayer for anything. I found that even if people don't have any religious beliefs, they're very open to prayer. The concept of prayer, knowing that you're in somebody's thoughts, is comforting. So something that I am intentional about doing at least once a week, every 2 weeks, I'll post a Facebook status. I'll say, is there anything I could pray for you this week? Is there anything that's on your mind, on your heart, that you really want me to pray for? I'll intentionally go out of my way to message people at least once a week, check in, see how they're doing, make sure that whatever's going on in their life, that they're mentally okay, they're mentally stable for the most part, being
as
much
stable as we can be.
Exactly. Stable as we can be.
Right. So do you have a specific time that had an impact on a person, that they called you or they checked in with you and said, actually, I could really use your help?
I can think of many situations where I've been able to connect with people over social media. I think back to one friend in particular where she came up to me one day and she was like, I don't know what it is about you, but you're just different. The way that you interact with people, it's so different. You're so comfortable. You're so intentional. How do I get there? And she kind of broke down and she kind of revealed all to me. And we spent 3 hours talking about her life story and everything that she'd been through. And by being intentional with my words and being intentional with my interactions, I allowed her to be comforted and I allowed her to feel like she was in a safe space. And most of our interactions were over the phone, or over text, and then when we would meet up in person, it was like the same. It's like we've known each other for years, and she just broke out into tears, and she she told me everything that was going on, and we were able to connect.
So there are two parts to that story that I think are really, really important, especially if people that are listening to this podcast want to do something in terms of leveraging this amazing tool that we have at our fingertips.
Mm-hmm.
And one is that what you were putting out on social media, whichever platforms you were using, was accessible to people and relatable to people. And again, you'll hear this from all of my connections. The word for me is intention.
Mm-hmm.
And so for you to use that word that many times, of course, it triggers immediate connection with me. And so that was the first thing that stood out, was you're putting out these very intentional posts that make people feel comfortable that they can talk to you, whether it's via text or private message or whatever. But the next part, I think, is the most important part. Once you've started putting out that intentional material, the intentional content about helping people or about being open and creating an environment where people feel safe to share those innermost thoughts and concerns and fears. And that is that you were available to her physically afterward. So you developed this relationship with her online where she felt safe and comforted. And then you were there face to face as well. So she wouldn't have come to you, I don't think, in that condition had she not already had that relationship with you through social media.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So maybe that's our answer to that question. How do we leverage it? And I, again, it's so important to follow up with that physical availability.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what, what we're doing with Reborn. That's what we're aiming to do, is we want to generate a platform where people can come together, but we also want to have the opportunity for these people to meet in person. Through blog posts, through social media, you can only connect so far. You can create a comfortable environment, but that's why we want to go out into the community. We want to create events. We want to create different platforms and opportunities and programs for these people to come together and have these interactions, to serve, to volunteer, to meet, because it is the virtual age, the digital age. It's so accurate to say that these generations, I'm 20 and I can't even catch up with the kids that are 13 at this point.
I know.
It's crazy how fast this technology is evolving. And that's why we need to leverage it. That's why we need to utilize it, but not just take it through, take it to the point that, okay, we're using social media, we've learned how to utilize these platforms, but to take it to the next level and say, okay, we've made these connections. Now let's do something with them. Let's get together. Let's start a movement. Let's be passionate. Let's change the world. That's really what it's all about.
That is such a relief and so encouraging to hear that. The understanding that developing the relationships online is fine, but that at the same time we need to leverage it so that we can improve our face-to-face relationships.
Yes.
And that's exactly what I was looking for from you. I knew you would bring that. I knew you'd bring that and put it all together for me. So I'm just going to share one more story, and I'm hoping that this will trigger a story for you to share.
Sure.
I was on a road trip. I wrote a blog post about this a long time ago, but I was on a road trip with our two boys, and one was asleep in the back seat and the other was DJing. And I had given them both permission to download certain songs onto my phone so that we could play them on this long road trip. And I gave them a certain budget. You can download songs up to $10 or $20 or whatever it was. So my older son had been sitting next to me providing the music for our road trip for an hour or so. And he put on a song called Astronaut. And I had never heard it before. And at first I was I wasn't fully present. I was driving. I had all this stuff on my mind. I was in a really bad job. That my boss was really abusive, extremely mean to me, and manipulative. And so my mind was there. It wasn't with my boys in the car where it should have been. And we're in the middle of nowhere in Wyoming, which most of Wyoming is the middle of nowhere. So it could have been anywhere in Wyoming between Montana and Denver. And I remember hearing toward the end of the song the lyrics was, can anybody hear me? I'm out here by myself. And all of a sudden that kind of sunk into my active
Mm-hmm.
brain. And I got myself out of that weird place where my brain was not present. And I looked over at my older son and kind of realized he was trying to tell me something, but he wasn't looking at me. And I said, wait a minute, can you play that song again? He said, okay. And it's, can anybody hear me? Am I out here by myself? And it's just this, I'm stuck here in the middle of space and no one's out here and I need somebody to reach out to me. And it's such a sad song, but it also has an edge of hopefulness to it. And I'm looking at my preteen son. He must have been 12. And my eyes just filled with tears. And I realized this kid is trying to tell me something through his music. And I think this is such an important memory for me, not only about being present, but recognizing that face-to-face relationship, sitting in a car for hours at a time, is part of what builds our relationship and makes him trust me, so that whatever is going online, he knows he can take it offline and talk to me about it.
Mm.
And I hope that that's the case. You'd have to ask him.
Mhm.
But here we are years later, and I still feel very close with him. And I think a lot of that is what you said, being intentional, being present, whether that's online or offline.
Mm.
So does that trigger a memory for you, a story that you could share that's similar to that, or that has your own take on that connection?
Yes, actually. It did actually trigger a memory about my mom. As I had said earlier, she struggles with paranoid schizophrenia. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with that diagnosis, but for maybe people who don't, to give you more of a real life example pertaining to her situation specifically, because it varies from person to person. But she would struggle with hallucinations and delusions, and she would think that there was a chip in her brain and that everybody was looking at her and everybody knew everything about her. She was very paranoid, very anxious, very upset. And she was diagnosed with that at this point almost 7 years ago, which is crazy that it's
Wow.
been that long. But probably 3 or 4 years ago, I came across this song, similar situation where it was a song, because when my mother was struggling with this, I disassociated myself in the beginning. And that is very odd for someone like me who's so passionate about mental health. I didn't really understand at first why that was going on, but I realized the discomfort when you are in a situation with a mental health issue and it's your own life. It's very
Yes,
different.
it's totally different. Mm-hmm.
Yes, very different than if you're helping somebody else. So there was this song that came across my Spotify playlist one day, and it was a song by this band called Daughter, and it's called Medicine. And some of the lyrics of the song, I pulled them up, is that you've got a warm heart, you've got a beautiful brain, but it's disintegrating from all the medicine. From all the medicine. And it continues on and on. You could still be what you want to be, what you said you were when you met me. And that really resonated with me because it made me realize something that I had never thought about before when it came to my mother. And that was, I had shut her out because I was so nervous that she wasn't the same person, because she wasn't. She
Right.
was somebody different from this illness, from this medicine. And I had kind of generated this disconnect with her. I didn't communicate with her. I disassociated with her, like I said. And this song really put into words what I was feeling in a way that I could never express it effectively. And it really made me break down. I remember just putting the song on replay and crying and crying and
Mm-hmm.
crying, listening to these lyrics. You've got a second chance. You could go home, escape it all. All of these words. And after a couple hours of tears, I came to a realization, as the song says, you could still be what you want to be, what you said you were when I met you. And it helped me to realize that I needed to be there for her. You know, she would text me, I would text her back. It would be that sort of conversation, but in person, I would just put up this roadblock and I would ignore her because I was so nervous of, you know, seeing who she really was now that she was different. And this song really resonated with me, and it really pushed me out of my boundaries to realize that she has changed, but that doesn't mean that there's no hope for her.
Where
You
were
know,
you?
where was I when I was
Yeah.
listening to the song?
Uh-huh.
I was in my room by myself. I was 15, 16 years old at a time in my life where I was feeling so overwhelmed and anxious about everything and just digging into school. That's why I'm the student that I am, because that's what I would do to distract myself. That I was just avoiding everything. And this song really like tore me apart. You know, it
Do you
really
remember
adequately.
do you remember what it was like inside your room, whether it was warm or did you have windows? Do you remember any of those details?
I remember it was dark. I remember it was nighttime. I remember, I think it was raining, interestingly enough. It was a
Mm-hmm.
particularly gloomy day, even though I love the rain. And it was cold in my room, and it was the perfect mood to just sit and cry. You know, the setting
Mm-hmm.
was all in place for it to be the perfect moment for this to happen.
There are so many pieces to this story that I could spend time on, but it isn't really part of the theme of this particular podcast. So we'll just have to talk about that another time. But
Yes.
what I'm hearing more than anything is that connection to music.
Yeah.
And that is another aspect of our digital world that I think sometimes we underestimate and under leverage. When I post a long form blog post, whether it's on my website or LinkedIn, where a medium, sometimes I'll actually embed a video of a song
Mm.
because it is relevant to whatever I'm writing about. And I think this leads kind of right back into that whole idea of leveraging our digital world to improve our real life. And part of that is sharing the music that we share,
Yeah.
and because we have so much access to it. Wow, I'm loving that this turned back around and fit right into this whole idea. So now I'm wondering where we're going to go with this over the next few weeks or years. You and I think we'll both
Mm-hmm.
remember this concept of also including music in whatever we're doing online so that we continue to create that space, even in the digital world, where people feel like they can come to us and then follow up with something face to face whenever possible.
Absolutely, because, you know, just as I was sharing with this song and just as you were sharing with your situation, similarly with music, music can break down those boundaries that are blocking us from those in-person interactions as well. You know, it's a great platform to utilize as another form of media, like you were saying. You know, when we are so disconnected from the world around us, songs can adequately put into words so poetically the things that sometimes we can't, you know, and they
Mm-hmm.
really speak to your heart, to your
Exactly.
emotions. And that's the power of it. That's really the power of it.
Yes, absolutely. And I keep coming back to these ideas like if I can't feed you in person, I'm going to nourish you through music and words. I would
Yes.
rather feed people in person. I mean, I love to cook. I love to have people at my dining room table. That is where I find that I can really nourish and nurture people is at my dining room table. But when I can't do that, we have to just keep creating space wherever we are, digitally or in person, where
Yes,
people can trust that they can be who they are and not be worried about whether their online persona matches their offline persona.
absolutely.
I
Hmm.
am so glad we had this conversation.
I am as
Thank
well.
you. Thank
Thank
you
you.
for taking the time to meet with me on this podcast. And if you'd like to learn more about Project Reborn and Nicole, check out the blog post associated with this podcast. We will have the website Reborn, ways that you can contribute and donate. You do have a donate button, right, Nicole?
Yeah,
Good.
absolutely.
Um, and you'll learn more about Nicole. I will include a link to her bio and her LinkedIn profile. So please connect with her, ask her more about her program, Reborn. I'm really excited to see where this will go. And I am looking forward to collaborating with you when you start really getting active in translating these conversations to face-to-face conversations.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com. Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell?